There's an episode in the Parsha involving a person other than Avraham Avinu that I think is so important and so relevant to understand the foundation of Judaism in the proper context. It involves a man whose name is Malki Tzedek, and he is part of the celebration of the victory that Avraham has just experienced after waging the battle against the four kings in order to rescue his nephew Lot from captivity, because Lot was living with the people of Sodom in the Sodom territory. They were taken captive by the army of the four kings, and Avraham galvanized an army, goes out to fight, is able to be victorious in battle, and is able to bring back a whole bunch of people who were captives, as well as a tremendous amount of these community assets that he makes every effort to return to every single city-state that he has been victorious in being able to gain emancipation for. There's a man whose name is Malki Tzedek, and we don't know, he's a very mysterious figure because he only appears here, and he's known as Melech Shalem, the king of Salem, which eventually would be known as Jerusalem, Jerusalem, okay? So Hotzi Lechem Vayayin, he produces bread and wine, and this is in your sheet. V'hu Chohein Lekel Elyon, and he was a priest to the God of up high. It's a very strange way of describing Hashem. It's not the normal way that we would describe Hashem. Vayivara, and we don't know what it means to be a priest of God of up high, especially in a time before Judaism has even gotten started. Vayivarachehu vayomar, and so he blessed him and he said, Baruch Avram lekel elyon, blessed is Avram to the God of Most High, konei shamayim va'aretz, who acquires heaven and earth. And then he said, Uvaruch kel elyon, and blessed is the God of Most High, asher migain tzarecha biyadecha, that who has protected all of the contents in your hands, vayiten lo maaser mikol, and he gave him tithes from everything that he had. Now, it seems like Avraham gave Malki Tzedek tithes, and this was a foreshadowing of what every Jew is supposed to do. Is supposed to tithe his produce and tithe his assets to the holy person of the population. What's the purpose of this whole episode? It seems not to add anything to the texture of the story, because Malki Tzedek is never heard from again, and he really has nothing to do with Lot or Avram, other than his being presented in this particular episode. The Netziv has a fascinating commentary. Rabbi Harav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, the last Rosh Yeshiva of the Volozhiner Yeshiva in the late 19th century, says as follows, and you have it in your text. Hifsik HaKasuv Devar Malki Tzedek Bein Yitzias Melech Sodom Lidvar V'im Avraham Avinu. This story, this episode, is positioned in between the freedom, the emancipation of the king of Sodom who was taken into captivity, and when the king of Sodom spoke with Avraham Avinu right after Avram meets with Malki Tzedek. What happened in the ensuing psukim is that right after this episode with Malki Tzedek, the king of Sodom approaches Avram and he says, Ten li es hanefesh ve'es harechush kachlach. You know what, Avram, I have a good deal. You give me the citizens of Sodom, and you can take all of the inanimate spoils of war. And Avram responds to him, and he says, I swear by the God of Most High, Konei Shemayim Va'aretz, who acquires heaven and earth. They're using a very similar language to what Malki Tzedek had used. And he says, Im michut ve'ad tzeroch na'al, I will not take anything from you. I don't want to take any spoils of war that belong to the people of Sodom, not a thread, not a shoelace. And velo somar ani ha'esharti es Avram. so that you should never say that you were responsible for Avraham's wealth. So that's the story that comes immediately after the episode with Melchizedek. So then Tziv says that the reason why this episode is positioned here and why the Torah makes a point of saying it, L'lamdeinu de teshuvas Avram b'loshem kel elyon konei shamayim v'aretz lamad mi Melchizedek. It's to tell us that Avram's formulation of his description of God as the kel elyon, as the God of Most High, who acquires heaven and earth, is a term that he had learned. This is a description of God that he had learned not from his own understanding of Hashem, but that it was a terminology that he had learned from Melchizedek. V'hachi mevu'ar b'she'iltos the Rav Achai Parshas Ekev u'mehechan zachu Yisrael l'parsha zu mibracha shebirachan Shem. That the whole way that the Jewish people merited this portion is because of the blessing of their ancestor Shem. Now Shem is none other than Melchizedek. According to tradition, Melchizedek really was Noach's son Shem, who really is an ancestor of Avraham Avinu. He's a great-great-great-great-grandfather of Avraham Avinu. But he has something to teach his great-great-grandson. And he teaches him, this is how we describe God. The Kevin Sheshama Avraham Shemuazu, Afu Nishba Harimosi Yadi El Hashem Kel Elyon Konei Shamayim Va'aretz. Once Avraham heard this terminology, he used the same terminology in order to swear to Hashem, and he says, I lift up my hand to the God of Most High, who acquires heaven and earth. Now, the question is, what is the significance of this phrase? That I lift up my hand to the God of Most High who acquires heaven and earth. Avram learned it from Melchizedek, but we haven't explained what its import is and why it's significant and why Avram uses it specifically when addressing the king of Sodom. The simplest explanation is that Avram Avinu simply needed to understand how people related to God in his society. Avram Avinu had his own way of relating to Hashem based upon his own personal experiences and his own intellectual understanding of Hashem. But he wanted to be able to share with others a sort of a common experience of God. And so he needed to use a phraseology that people would appreciate. And so when he hears Melchizedek using a terminology to describe a God of Most High, he's able to import sort of that terminology and use it when communicating with someone else from that region so that they'll understand what he's referring to. It's very important to understand that one of the great things about Avraham Avinu, probably the most important point about Avraham Avinu that distinguishes him from his son Yitzchak and from his son Yaakov, is that with Avraham Avinu, there was no one to show him the way. Avraham Avinu got his entire Mesorah, his entire tradition, or almost his entire tradition, based upon his own understanding of Hashem. Someone asked me the other day the question, why is it that with Yitzchak such a hubbub is made over who he's going to marry? And with Yaakov, such a concern and such detail is given to how Yaakov finds his wife originally Rachel, and then Leah, and then Bilhah and Zilpah. But no detail whatsoever is given to Abraham's discovery of his wife Sarah. He didn't have to travel to a well to find his wife Sarah. At least the Torah doesn't detail that. He didn't have to make a bargain with Sarah's father in order to be able to marry her. We don't find any of that kind of discussion in the making of the shidduch between Avram and Sarah. The Torah just tells us at the end of Parshas Noach that he took his wife Sarah and they traveled to Ur Kasdim. We have no background information on who this Sarah was, who her family was, how he married her. And the question that the person asked me was, why is that? Why do we not know anything about their marriage and how they met each other and so forth? And it seems to me very simple. It seems to me it's because Avraham and Sarah were self-made. So their past history and how they met and how they got to know each other and how they discovered Hashem together is really not important for us, because all we need to know is that they started at some point to understand and discover God as a couple. It may very well be that when they first got married, they weren't into God at that point. They became Balei Tshuva after they got married, right? Which happens to many of us, yes? And therefore, it's not so relevant to us. We obsess over shidduchim, right, for our children, right? And so we're concerned about how they're going to meet. Are they going to meet at a well, or are they going to meet at a hotel lobby, or are they going to meet here, or are they going to meet there? And we obsess over the parents and the in-laws and the cousins and all of these other things. And that's certainly reasonable when we think about Yitzchak and Yaakov Avinu and how they met their spouses. But Avraham was the prototypical Baal Tshuva, where, you know what, in retrospect, none of that stuff matters, because they grew together as a couple in their understanding of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And therefore, what they were in their previous life and how they met, all of that has no relevance to their service of God at this point in their lives. So Avraham is self-made, but what's also I think very important, sometimes we overlook this, is that Avraham Avinu was not living in a vacuum. And there were certain very vital lessons that, despite the fact that his world was a godless world, and there was plenty of amorality and immorality that was going on in Avraham Avinu's time, there were still valuable lessons that he could take from people that were living around him. There were people in his time, like Malki Tzedek, righteous Gentiles, who had an appreciation for a divine spirit, who would be able to provide some kind of benevolent emanation to the world. And even though a person may not have had a clearly defined understanding of who God was back then, but at least they understood that there was some higher being, some higher power, like we call him today, in the secular world. Right? And that in itself was of value to Avraham Avinu. We sometimes underplay in our world today, we underplay the value that we can gain from certain kinds of secular messages and lessons and ideas that we can actually incorporate within Judaism to enrich and make us possess a more robust Judaism. And even if it's just for the purposes of communication, the ability to communicate certain ideas using literature and using expressions and idioms from the secular world can actually very much enhance the messages of Torah. And this, of course, as you're probably aware, is done all the time, even though sometimes the proper attribution is not made. And it's for this reason that I wanted to show you something that I came across just learning. We learn every evening between Mincha and Ma'ariv, we learn a sefer called Chovot HaLevavot, the duties of the heart, which is an amazing work. God willing, in about 10 years when we finish the Kuzari, we can start Chovot HaLevavot. It was written by Rabbeinu Bachya ibn Pakuda, who himself lived a little bit before Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. One thing is clear, no matter what we're going to say about Chovot HaLevavos, it's a beautiful Musar work. It's a beautiful work on helping us to understand what really a person's mind is supposed to be thinking when he's doing mitzvahs and things like that. But the way really, the attitudes, the proper attitudes and moral, heartfelt sensibilities that a Jew is supposed to have throughout the day, this is really what Chovot HaLevavos is all about. But there's no question that Rabbeinu Bachya ibn Pakuda, who lived in the same region as Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, was very, very influenced in the way that he chose to communicate his messages and his ideas by the secular world around him. And when I say secular, I don't mean godless or religiousness or religiousness, because it was a very, very religious society that Rabbeinu Bachya ibn Pakuda lived in. He lived in an Islamic society in Al-Andalus, which is the southern part of Spain, and there was a tremendous amount of both philosophical and religious ideology that was circulating throughout the secular world. And Rabbeinu Bachya had two options. He could have totally isolated himself and only poured over the works of the Chumash and the Nevi'im and Chazal in order to be able to extract a message that he felt the people of his generation needed. But as he writes in his introduction, he finds that there is a dearth of material that is contained in its most presentable form in the writings of the Nevi'im and Chazal that he wants to be able to present to his generation. And so he writes something very profound in one section of his introduction, which is on the backside of your handout. He writes as follows. He says, in presenting the Chovot HaLevavot, the duties of the heart, He says, "Vehevesi esrov harayos midevarim hamuvanim al yedei haseichel." In trying to present my arguments as why we have these obligations and what our obligations are, these emotional and intellectual obligations, I've used intellectual arguments. V'karafti osam el haseichel b'mishalim asher ein bahem safek. And I've used parables and analogies in order to be able to try and make them palatable to the intellect. V'tzarafti lahem es ma shematzasi b'sifrei haneviyim. I have also used many passages that I found in the words of the prophets. V'achar kach tzirafti lahem es hadivarim shekibalnu merabosenu zal. I then used the material that I found in the words of our sages in the Gemara and in the Midrash and so forth. U'mei hachasidim v'hachachamim shebechol umah. And furthermore, I have also incorporated into this work some of the writings of the saintly and wise men that have existed in every nation. Shedivreihem higiu eleinu, that their words have come to us to this day. In other words, if I have found wise aphorisms from Aristotle, I have not neglected to include that whenever I found that would further advance the cause of my argument. Mipnei sha'ani mekaveh shahalevavos yihiyu notim el divreihem umakshivim lechochmasam. Because it is my hope that people's hearts will be drawn to their words and will really be very much attentive to their wisdom and responsive to their wisdom. Kagon divrei hapilosofim umusarei hapirushim umanhigehem hachashuvim. He says we find many wise words of the philosophers and the musar admonitions of their ascetics and of their great and important leaders. Uchevar amur rabosenu zal. Our sages themselves make a point of accentuating this idea that we have what to learn from the other wise men of the other nations. Because the Gemara says, it presents a contradiction in the book of Yechezkel. It says, Kasuv echad omer, one verse states in Yechezkel that the prophet castigates them. Why? Because uchemishpatei hagoyim asher sevivo sechem asisem, that you have imitated the statutes and rules of the nations that are surrounding you. But on the other hand, a very adjacent verse to that says, because of Echad Omer, another verse says, Lo asisem, that you have not imitated the other nations, and that also is a reason for you to be punished. So Hakeh said, how do you reconcile the two? Kimisukanim shebahem lo asisem, kimikulkalim shebahem asisem. That when it came time to emulating the righteous deeds and the proper deeds of the other nations around you, there you refused to listen. But when it came to imitating the immoral acts of the other nations, that you felt that you could emulate. So you're guilty for both. We're guilty if we emulate the bad things that we find in society around us, but we're also, to a certain degree, guilty if we don't take advantage of the lessons that are beautiful around us in the world. There are lessons that we can take from the world outside of us that we can incorporate within Judaism. This whole idea of environmentalism, which of course taken to its extreme becomes a form of idolatry. But when taken in moderation, when we try to understand that there is a greater sense of connection with the entire world that Hashem made, and we have to appreciate the world that HaKadosh Baruch Hu made, and we have to try and preserve the world that Hashem gave to us, and therefore we should be recycling, and we should be energy conscious, and we should worry about global warming if there is such a thing, and things like that, right? But the very idea of being conscious of these things and doing our best to try and preserve the world that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us, there's value to that. Perhaps this may be, not that it should supplant religion as it has for other people, but the fact that if we put it into its proper perspective, there's value to that. There's value to understanding the principles of compassion that exist among some of the other nations of the world. The idea of benevolence to other nations outside of the Jewish people, the idea of racial tolerance and equality, where sometimes you find that sometimes in certain enclaves within the Jewish community, bigotry still exists based on the color of a person's skin. which is truly lamentable when the outside society has already gone well past us in those areas. Those are things that we have to say to ourselves, maybe there is something that I can learn from the rest of the world at some point. Maybe there are things that I can learn, just like Avraham learned how to describe HaKadosh Baruch Hu in his ability, in trying to find a message that he could communicate to the rest of the world. We have to be able to find those messages as well. And he says, V'od amru chachameinu zal, he says, I'm just continuing from Rabbeinu Bachai in the Chovos Levavos, he says, our sages further tell us, Kol ha'omer devar chochma afilu b'umos ha'olam nikra chacham. Anyone who says a word of wisdom, even if he's part of the other nations of the world, is still called a wise man. Okay, so that's all we needed to see from there. Anyway, that's the first thing that I wanted to mention from the lessons that we can take from Malki Tzedek. But that only begs the question, why did Malki Tzedek use the term Kel Elyon? I lift up my hand to, I present to you, this gift, Malki Tzedek says, when he produces the bread and the wine, and he says, this is based on my blessing to God of Most High. Why does he use the term Kel Elyon? And why does he use the term Konei Shamayim V'Aretz, who acquires heaven and earth? What's interesting is that the Medrash is also bothered why Malki Tzedek used the term Konei Shamayim V'Aretz. And this is the next text that you have in your sheet. What I want to do is just skip to the second line. And Omer Rabbi Yitzchak says that the reason why it is appropriate to use the term Konei Shamayim V'Aretz, that God acquires heaven and earth, is, he says, because Hayam Mekabel et ha'ovrim ve'et ha'shavim, that Avraham Avinu used to have a custom of receiving people who were travelers, wayfarers on the road, and he would accept them into his home and give them food. And when they would, before they would sit down and eat a meal, Avraham Avinu would say to them, make a bracha. Ve'hein omrim lo, ma nomar. What bracha should we say? Who should we bless? V'hu omer lahem, imru baruch kel olam she'achalnu mishalo. He said that you should make a bracha to the God of the world, that you're eating his beautiful, you're partaking of his beautiful world, the delicious food that God has given you. So Amar le HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so Hashem says to Avraham, Ani lo haya shemi nikar leberiosai, that I was not well known to my creations. I created everything, but not everyone knew me, not everyone understood me, knew what I was all about. Vihikarti osa beberiosai, and you, Avraham, you get a big yishar koach, because what you did is that you familiarized me to the rest of the world. You made my name known to the rest of the world by say thanks to God, to every stranger that you met. I sometimes I feel it's like a very goyish thing to do, but when after I say goodbye to someone that has done me a very nice thing on the phone, I say, God bless you. Even though it sounds like a very Gentile thing to do. But, we should be using God in our speech, not only with ourselves and say, Baruch Hashem, Hashem should give you a bracha. We should use that with the way that we speak to non-Jews as well, because we're supposed to be like Avraham, incorporating the use of God's name, even in the non-Jewish world as well. So Avraham, you get a yishar koach because you familiarized me to the world. So ma'ale ani alecha, ki ilu ata shutaf imi b'biriyaso shel olam. So therefore, Avraham, I am going to consider it as if you're my partner in creation. It's true, I created the whole world. No human being creates the world. But every time we bring God's name into this world, then we become partners with Hashem in the creation of the world. Hahu dirsiv konei shamayim va'aretz. And therefore, that's why God is known as the acquirer of heaven and earth. What that means is that it's true, God doesn't just acquire the earth. You acquire something that you didn't have before, and you didn't have it yesterday, and now you get it today, so you're a koneh. You acquire heaven and earth. So why do we say that God acquires heaven and earth when he's always had it? He never lost it. The answer is that he did lose it to a sense, because when the world didn't know God, and it was because of Avraham that the world became acquainted with Hashem, So that's how God became the koneh. He became now the new acquirer of the world. He newly acquired the world as a result of Avraham Avinu. So that's why Melchizedek, when he wants to give thanks to Hashem, and he sees Avraham Avinu before him, he uses the term koneh shemayim, because he's not only thanking God, but he's giving attribution to Avraham as being God's partner. It's because of you that God has now re-entered the conversation, has re-entered into this world and into the consciousness of every human being. So that would at least explain why Melchizedek uses the term koneh, and now Avraham feels at liberty to use the term koneh shamayim va'aretz when he's speaking with the king of Sodom, to try and transmit to him that what I am about to do for you is a demonstration of being partners with Hashem in the world. That I try to emulate God and I try to give back to the world just as God has given to us. Now let's take a look. And as far as the Kel Elyon part, the God of Most High, perhaps we'll see an explanation for that shortly. But again, as I mentioned, the simple understanding is that this would be just a normal way to attribute godliness to a God who is extremely transcendent and has been missing from the world for a long time, because people didn't know about God. And that's why he's known as the Kel Elyon, the God of Most High, and he's just now recently come back into man's world. And that's all because of Avraham Avinu. Now if you take a look at Rashi over here, Rashi tries to explain why Melchizedek produced bread and wine. And this is all going to be related to this, to the message that we're supposed to get from the story of Melchizedek. Rashi says over here, Kach osim liyigi'ei milchama, that when people come back weary from the battlefield, the people who are there to greet them, generally, that's the minhag, they bring out for them bread and wine to revive their spirit. Veher alo she'en b'libo alav al shaharag et banav. And what Melchizedek was trying to show Avram was that he had no tainas, he had no grievances against Avram, even though Shem was the father of all Semitic nations, and this was the man Melchizedek, and therefore ultimately in the course of battle, not only did Avram save many of his grandchildren, but he also killed many of his grandchildren. Melchizedek wanted to show to him, I have no tainas, I have no grievances against you. You did what you needed to do in order to rectify the wrong, in order to make things right. And therefore, I want to show you that we are friends. But then Rashi brings a Midrash Agadah. He brings from a Midrash that says, Ramazlo al hamenachot ve'al hanesachim sheyakrivu sham banav. That Melchizedek wanted to allude to Avraham a portent of the future. And he wanted to show him that one day in this very place, in this land called Salem, which will one day be called Jerusalem, your children, your descendants will be offering nesachim and menachot, which are flour offerings, which is represented by the bread, and wine libations, which is represented by the wine. And that's what he was alluding to him prophetically, that one day in this very spot there will be a Beis HaMikdash, and your descendants will be able to offer these wonderful gifts to Hashem. And that's what the bread and the wine represents. Are we clear? We understand why Melchizedek is doing this? So there's an obvious question. The question is, why is it that Melchizedek only produces those ancillary, just give me 1 second, napkin. Why is it that Melchizedek only produces bread and wine? What's the primary form of korban that's offered in the Beis HaMikdash? Animal sacrifice. So if really Melchizedek was going to try to prophetically allude to Avraham that there are going to be korbanos in the future, wouldn't it have been more appropriate to bring him out a tray of corned beef, with some pastrami, right? Right. After all, that's what Avraham Avinu serves to his guests, right? So why can Melchizedek bring that out to Avraham? Maybe he knew there was a problem with the kashrus. Maybe that could be the reason. I'm not sure. That certainly could be one reason. But this is the question that the Taz, the Turei Zahav, one of the great commentaries on Shulchan Aruch, who lives, I believe, in either the 17th or 18th century, he has a commentary on Rashi as well. And he asked this question, and this is from, it's the name of the commentary is called Divrei David. If you take a look, he says, Yesh Makshim. Some people ask the question, Lama lo hotzi lo basar l'ramez al shem, or l'ramez al shem sheyakrivu sham karbanot. Why didn't he produce meat, which is the primary emblem of sacrifices? V'nirli l'taretz, he says, it would seem to me, De'isa b'Ramban b'parsha LECH-LECHA she'amru b'sifri shelo nischayu b'nesachim ela mibiatan la'aretz, that there were a number of sacrifices that the Jewish people brought while they were still in the desert, but the only kind of sacrifice that they brought in the desert was animal sacrifice. There were no libations and there were no flour offerings that were brought in the desert. There's a very practical reason for that. In order to be able to produce wine and flour, you need to have fields. You need to have an agricultural society, which was certainly lacking when the Jews were traveling in the desert. So therefore, from a practical point of view, the only korbanos that the Jewish people had to bring while they were still in the desert were animal sacrifices. And therefore, what Melchizedek was trying to allude to Avraham Avinu is that there was going to be a certain kind of korban that will be unique to this spot, that will be particularly indigenous to the Beis HaMikdash. While it's true that there are going to be other korbanos that your children are going to bring before they come to Jerusalem, they'll be offering a lot of different korbanos on their way to the Beis HaMikdash, but when it comes to menachos and nisachim, when it comes to flour and wine offerings, the vegetation offerings, those will be unique to the Beis HaMikdash in Yerushalayim. That's what the Taz says. But the question then becomes, is it only because of practicality? Is it only because of convenience? Or is there an additional message that Melchizedek is trying to convey to Avraham Avinu? So I think that taken in its totality, there's one important point that I'd like to bring out, and it requires us to go back a little bit to sort of reverse the clock just a couple of parshiot and many, many years back to the story of Cain and Hevel. And the story of Cain and Hevel also revolves around two different kinds of korbanos. It revolves around the animal sacrifice of Hevel and the vegetation sacrifice of Cain. And the Torah tells us that Cain's sacrifice was not accepted by Hashem. And as Chazal tell us, it was not accepted by Hashem because he brought the lowest quality of vegetation possible. And Hevel's sacrifice was accepted by Hashem, even though the whole idea of offering a korban came from Cain to begin with, which is an interesting discussion unto itself, that Cain actually was the initiator of the whole idea of bringing korbanos, and sadly and tragically and pathetically, his korban is rejected, and Hevel, who's sort of the imitator, has his korban accepted. One of the reasons why Cain can't tolerate it, he can't stand it. You know, the Mefarshim say if you look at the names Cain and Hevel, you can learn a tremendous amount. Cain comes from the words Kanisi Ishes Hashem, that when Chava named Cain, she said, I have acquired a man together with Hashem, or from Hashem. And the word Cain therefore comes from the word kinyan, to acquire something. And you'll see this is quite relevant to our Konei Shemayim Ba'aretz in just a second. When you view yourself as the master of your field, when you view yourself as sort of the one who is responsible for producing the kochi va'otzim yadi asaliyat hachayil hazeh, that it is my wealth and my majesty and my strength that is responsible for producing all of the wealth that I possess today, so that gives you a sense of kinyan, that gives you a sense of ego, a sense of self-made possession. That's what Cain represents, and that's why it was so difficult for Cain to part from his possessions. The reason why he offered the worst possible korban to Hashem is because he knew intellectually that he owed God something. but he begrudgingly gave it to Hashem because he viewed himself as the primary producer of all that he had. The word Hevel, even though the Torah doesn't explain to us why he was named Hevel, comes from the same concept of Havel Havalim, Amar Koheles, Hakol Havel. Everything is vanity. Hevel represents a sense of selflessness, a nullification and negation of ego, and a nullification of self-importance, almost like a self-deprecation. Hevel didn't feel any sense of importance, of a self-identity, of emphasis on his own self, and as a result, he didn't even take the initiative to bring a korban because his argument was, what can I possibly offer that is of value to God? That's why he had to learn from Cain how to bring a korban in the first place. But once he learns from Cain how to bring a korban, he says it all belongs to God, because the very act of raising cattle is a much more humbling experience than the act of being a farmer. When you're a farmer and you till the soil and you're very, very involved and you work very, very hard to produce what you produced, you feel a sense of ownership. When you're involved in being a shepherd, then you realize that the animals grow, you're just there to feed them, and it's much less apparent. The robustness of the flock is not as easily attributed to your own hard work as it is to when you raise crops on your own. So therefore, Hevel, in his very occupation, actually sustains that sense of humility because of this sense of disconnect from the livestock that I'm raising and my own hard work. Whereas Cain feels that sense of self-importance and great accomplishment because he realizes that everything that grows from the soil is a direct result of my hard work, of tilling the soil, of tending to the soil, of constantly going out to the field to make sure it's properly irrigated and that the seeds are planted properly and the soil is properly fertilized and so forth. And so there is an inherent difference between agriculture, tilling the soil and producing things from the soil, and being a herdsman of raising animals. Being a farmer gives you a greater sense of accomplishment and ego. Being a herdsman gives you a greater sense of humility, if we can generalize in that way. If this is correct, using this principle, then we can understand why originally the Jewish people were not given the mandate to go out and bring korbanos to Hashem from their agriculture. Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu recognized the great potential flaw that exists by bringing vegetable sacrifices to God. Because a person will say to himself, at the very moment that he's pouring the libations of his wine and his flour to Hashem, he's going to say to himself, really what I'm giving to God is really a tremendous sacrifice of my own possessions. And therefore he's not going to be giving it with a full heart. He's going to say, I'm doing such a favor to God by offering this to him. Whereas when you offer an animal sacrifice, you really feel that you're giving God his due, because I didn't do very much. This animal is a blessing from Hashem to begin with, so it's only fair that Hashem, if he only asks for one small animal from my herd, I should be happy that that's all I need to part with to give it to Hashem. And I think that what Avraham was able to demonstrate as he's coming home victoriously from battle, and he's so ready to part with all of the spoils of war. He is ready to give back all of the citizenry to all of the city-states that he has been able to regain freedom for. He wants to return all of the spoils of war, all of the inanimate possessions that have been captured back from the four kings. He has demonstrated to Melchizedek that he is a person who has tremendous appreciation that everything that comes to him in life is from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Even those things which involve the blood, sweat, and tears of very hard work, of going out to war and organizing an army and working out a strategy and learning how to ambush and attack and so forth. Nevertheless, the fact that Avraham was a brilliant general of an army and was able to conquer back from 4 huge city-states and to reverse all of their victory and regain freedom for all of these other city-states that they had fought against, but Avraham is still very selfless and feels that it's not me, it's all God. It's all Hashem. Therefore, nothing is magia to me. Nothing comes to me. The very fact that Avraham was able to say that is why Melchizedek says to him, you're the kind of guy that deserves to have bread and wine. You appreciate the agriculture, that even when it comes to agriculture, it's all from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You understand? So that's why Melchizedek specifically says, you're the kind of person that will not abuse the vegetable sacrifices of a Kayin. You're not going to allow your ego to interfere with the lechem v'yayin gifts to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's a very interesting balance that we as the Jewish people have been able to create, even in modern Israel today. We have this tremendous sense of compassion, even in the midst of war, and we're constantly debating and struggling with ourselves. What are the ethics of war? What are the ethical ways to wage battle? How are we supposed to treat prisoners of war? How are we supposed to regain freedom for people, for our soldiers who have been taken into captivity? We agonize over whether we should trade 1,000 criminal, murderous terrorists for the sake of one Jewish soul, for one Gilad Shalit. But because we agonize over this, that's why we deserve the bread and the wine of the karbanos. That's why HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us that gift. It's because we have that tremendous sense of conscience that allows us to know how to handle the bread and the wine of our own hard work. You understand? Because when we are able to acknowledge that this does come from Hashem, and we have a sense of morality, that we have a duty to Hashem, that we have to sort of, at the end of the day, stand before God and make a reckoning, and then because Hashem is responsible for all of our welfares, that's the reason why, even in the state of war, where we feel this tremendous sense of accomplishment and success and victory, we're able to still feel at the same time tremendous humility and agony over what we've had to do at the battlefront. We have this tremendous conscience, that we as the Jewish people, and that's why we can handle lechem v'yayin, we can handle the bread and the wine that we offer up to Hashem. So that's why I think that Avraham Avinu was given this by Melchizedek, because Melchizedek was able to appreciate it. And there's another medrash that I think actually illustrates that very, very nicely. The medrash, and it's a very strange medrash, Medrash Tehillim, or Midrash Shochar Tov, it's also called on Tehillim, Lamed Zayin, 37. It's the bottom of your sheet. Omar HaKadosh Baruch Hu Kaneli. Hashem says, I want you to be jealous on my behalf. Sometimes jealousy is good. It's good to be jealous. She'ululei hakina ein holam omed. If people aren't jealous, the world would never continue. What do we mean by that? Ve'en adam nosei isha. Men would not marry women. Ve'eno boneh bayit. People would not build homes. And we can all relate to that, right? Guys only get married when they see all of their friends getting married. People build beautiful homes. People build beautiful homes because they see everyone else has a beautiful home. So that's why jealousy is good, says God, because it helps in derech eretz, it helps in the yishuv of the world. But now take a look at what the Midrash says. It says, "She'ilulei shekinei Avraham lo haya konei shamayim va'aretz." That if it were not for the fact that Avraham had a little bit of kinah, he had a little bit of jealousy, then he would never have been sharing with God this acquisition of heaven and earth. Ve'ematai kinei. When did Avraham have jealousy? She'omar l'Malkitzedek ketzad yatzata min hateva. He said when he had this meeting with Malkitzedek, who was, remember, he's Shem, he's Noah's son. He survived the flood on the ark for a year. He's been living on years and years ago, generations ago. He was this son of Noah. He lived on the Teva for a year. It was the most difficult year of his life. And he had to survive, feeding all of the animals. So he says, how did you survive and emerge from the ark? Omar lei b'tzedakah shehayinu osim sham. He said it was only by virtue of the charity, of the kindness that we performed on the ark. Omar lo v'chimat tzedakah hayalachem la'asos b'teva. So Avraham says to him, what kind of tzedakah did you have to do when you were on the Teva? V'chi aniyim hayusham? Were there schnorrers on the Teva? Actually, it wouldn't be a surprise. They find you wherever you go. So the Meshulachim probably found them on the Teva, right? But there were only Noach and his children on the teva. So who did you have to give tzedakah to? Who did you have to do an act of charity? He said, we provided charity to the animals, to the beasts of the wild, and to the birds. Lo hayinu yishenim. We didn't sleep a wink, he says, when we were on the teva. We would spend our whole night going from one animal to the other to make sure that they were all properly fed. Osa shas, when Avraham hears this, so he's filled with kinna. He has a little bit of jealousy, and that's a good thing. To be jealous for the sake of Hashem, to be jealous to do good things is actually a good thing. Which the Gemara says is kinna so from Tarbeh Chochmah. The rabbis who are rivals or have rivalry or jealousy among each other, that will increase wisdom. It will increase religiosity. But at that moment, Amar Avraham, Uma ilule shasu tzadakim behema v'chayva oflo hayayotzin. He says, that means to say that if they would not have done those acts of charity with the animals that were on the teva, they would not have merited to emerge from the ark. The kevin sha'asu tzedakah yatsu. He says, but it was because they did these acts of charity that they were able to get off the teva. Va'ani im e'eseh im b'nei adam al achas kama v'kama. So if I am able to do these acts of charity with my fellow man, not just animals, not just dumb animals, but with human beings, compassionate, sensitive, caring, feeling human beings, then surely God will allow me to emerge from my own teva, whatever that teva is of our own, the own shackles of our own devices. So, ba'osa shah nata eshel bi be'er sheva achila shtia uluvi. And that's when Avraham, as we're going to read in next week's parsha, plants an eshel. The word eshel is some kind of bush or tree, but it stands for Aleph Shin Lamed, as we all know, Achila, Shtia, and Livia. The Medrash says Livia. There's two different girsot. So the Medrash says it stands for eating, drinking, and escorting your guests. You have to always escort your guests. There's brought down, you should always walk out your guests at least 4 amot, 4 cubits outside your home. I'm not sure how that works in the middle of the winter in Toronto. We're trying to got to put on your coats first and then escort them out. But the point is that you see that Avram's encounter with Melchizedek brings out within him this spirit of benevolence, this spirit of sharing, this spirit of giving. And it's his encounter and his intersection with Melchizedek that transforms him into this man of chesed. And that's what allows him to be able to be worthy of the bread and the wine that Melchizedek gives to him. It goes really back to what we started with, which is that Avraham does not grow up in a vacuum. He does not develop as the great Avraham, the great Baal Tshuva, who comes close to God just out of nowhere, spontaneously generated. He is very much a product of his society. His society has given him some very hard knocks and has presented him with reasons to compel him to run the other way from his society. But there are certain sparks within his society which inspire him and impel him to move forward and closer to Hashem. Some very important lessons that we learn from both Melchizedek and Avraham.